This is Richart Wolff, and let me be blunt. When the people who decide which drugs are safe start looking like Wall Street revenge traders, the system is already broken. The head of America's drug approval machine, the man sitting on top of the FDA's entire drug division, has just resigned under investigation. Not after years of controversy, not after a long review. He was put on leave on a Friday, gone by Sunday. That is not how a stable public health institution works. That is how a political operation in crisis behaves when it finally trips over its own mess. Dr. George Tidmarsh was supposed to be the firewall between you and dangerous medicine. Instead, he's now accused of doing what every corporate crook and Trump-style appointee seems to do when you hand them power, treating a public office like a personal weapon. Let's lay out what we know. Federal officials say there were serious concerns about his personal conduct, a bland phrase that Washington uses when it doesn't want to say the ugly part out loud. At the very same time, a Canadian drug company, Aurinia Pharmaceuticals, files a lawsuit accusing him of using his government position to settle an old score with a business rival. That's not regulation. That's a grudge match with a federal seal on it. According to the lawsuit, Tidmarsh didn't just criticize some random biotech product at a bar. He publicly went after one of Aurinia's FDA-approved kidney drugs on LinkedIn, saying it lacked proven clinical benefit. Within hours, the company's stock dropped so hard, it erased more than $350 million in value. One post, one man, hundreds of millions gone. Not because the science changed, not because new data came out, because a powerful regulator opened his mouth. If that sounds familiar, it should. It's the same Trump era culture. Markets moved not by research, not by regulation, but by the whims, feuds, and online tantrums of people in power. Under Trump, we normalized presidents tweeting companies into panic at 3 a.m. Now, apparently, we have senior health officials doing the LinkedIn version of that with life-saving medication. And here's the detail that turns this from messy into dangerous. This wasn't a random opinion about policy. The lawsuit says Tidmarsh has a long-running personal beef with Kevin Tang, the company's board chair and a former colleague who allegedly helped push him out of previous biotech jobs. So when the government says personal conduct, what it may really mean is this: a senior regulator using the badge of public authority to kneecap an enemy in the markets. You cannot overstate how corrosive that is. The FDA's entire power comes from trust. You don't see the lab data. You don't audit every clinical trial. You trust that when a drug hits the shelf, it got there because a bunch of scientists argued over the evidence, not because someone in a corner office wanted revenge or airtime. But it gets worse because Tidmarsh says this isn't about revenge at all. He claims he's the one being punished for doing his job too well. His version? He spoke out against a new internal FDA plan to fast-track drug approvals, collapsing months of scientific review into as little as a single day, one day. That's not oversight, that's a drive-through. He says he warned that this shortcut was illegal, that it concentrated too much power in one person's hands, that it ripped out the very safeguards that protect patients. And what happened next, according to him, was not a debate, not a review of the plan, but retaliation. A regulator who raised a red flag on speed run approvals suddenly finds himself under scrutiny, on leave, then out. So on one side, you have a lawsuit framing him as a Trump-style petty tyrant, using his position for a vendetta. On the other, you have his claim that he's the whistleblower, crushed for challenging a reckless plan to turn drug approvals into a political checkbox. Only one of these stories can be fully true. But notice what they have in common. In both, science is nowhere near the center. Power is. And that's the Trump legacy playing out in slow motion. Years of attacking the deep state, trashing experts, turning regulators into villains and cronies into heroes, have done exactly what they were designed to do: hollow out institutions until they can be bent to serve personal agendas. You don't need Trump physically inside the building for Trumpism to infect the culture. You just need people who learned from his example that public authority is a tool, not a responsibility. Inside this FDA, the numbers already tell the story. Over 1,000 staff under Tidmarsh, waves of departures in a single year, burnouts, layoffs, quiet exits, vaccine officials harassed by far-right operatives, resigned and then rehired like pawns in a political show, morale collapsing, oversight stretched thin, expertise walking out the door. You can't run a serious science-based regulatory agency on fear, chaos, and revenge. And who pays for this? Not Tidmarsh, not the executives passing each other lawsuits in boardrooms. It's the patients who never see their drug approved because no one trusts the process anymore. It's the families in rural states, many of them Trump voters, who depend on disability benefits and safe, affordable medication. When Washington turns the FDA into another battlefield for personal wars, those communities become collateral damage. An FDA that can't keep its own leadership from acting like a feud-driven stock trader is an FDA that cannot convincingly tell the country this pill is safe, this vaccine is effective, this drug is worth the risk. Once that belief cracks, every bottle on every shelf starts to look less like medicine and more like a bet someone else placed with your life on the line. When that belief cracks, you don't just have a scandal. You have a system that starts to eat itself. Because look at the bigger pattern, not just the one man. This isn't happening in some sleepy agency off to the side. This is inside the FDA under a health secretary who was sold to Trump's base as the guy who would take on big pharma and clean up the swamp. Instead, what we're seeing looks a lot closer to a Trump-style purge: blow up trust in the institution, hollow it out, then hand what's left to people who treat science like a political accessory. Under this leadership, the FDA hasn't been strengthened, it's been destabilized. Senior vaccine officials resign after being targeted by far-right activists, then get brought back like chess pieces in a political stunt. Whole divisions report burnout. Internal surveys, the kind agencies hate making public, show double-digit drops in morale. In some offices, 1 out of every 4 senior positions is either vacant or filled by acting staff, people who know they can be replaced the minute they say the wrong thing. On paper, Trump and his allies scream that they're fighting unelected bureaucrats and corrupt regulators. In practice, what do they build? A regulator who can allegedly tank a foreign company's stock with a single LinkedIn post while sitting in an office paid for by U.S. taxpayers. A fast-track plan that can push drugs through in 24 hours. Not 24 weeks, 24 hours. That's not draining the swamp. That's draining the lab. And it fits perfectly with the economic logic of Trumpism. You tell the base that regulation is a plot by globalists to hold America back. You tell donors that you're going to unleash innovation and cut red tape. Then you quietly turn the referee into a political appointee who knows that his survival depends less on data and more on loyalty. The result is not freedom, it's captured regulation, a watchdog that knows who it's allowed to bite. The numbers behind this are brutal. In the last decade, the top 10 pharmaceutical giants have pulled in over $1 trillion in combined revenue. 1 year of profit for a single big pharma heavyweight can top 20 or 30 billion dollars. For them, shaving months off an approval timeline isn't just efficiency, it's billions in market advantage. Every day earlier on the market is another day of monopoly pricing, another wave of stock bonuses, another chance to show Wall Street the growth it demands. Now imagine putting that much money on the table and telling one politically shielded official you can approve this in a day. What kind of pressure does that create? What kind of phone calls? What kind of quiet dinners, off the record meetings, glowing think tank reports funded by industry partners? You don't have to invent a conspiracy theory. You just have to understand capitalism. This is why the stock crash detail matters so much. When a single comment from a regulator can wipe out $350 million in market value in a matter of hours, you're seeing raw power. When there's a personal grudge layered on top of that, you're seeing weaponized power. And when that power sits inside an agency that already wants to compress scientific review into a single day, you're seeing the exact opposite of what a public health regulator is supposed to be. Trumpism always sells itself as anti-elite, anti-corporate, anti-big something. But every time you pull back the curtain, you find the same pattern: chaos for the public, clarity for the insiders. The ordinary patient gets mixed signals, contradictory statements, and eroding trust. The political allies and financial backers get access, speed, and leverage over the rule book. Look at who gets hurt first. When the FDA turns unstable, not the hedge fund manager with concierge doctors and private clinics, it's the people in states with the highest rates of disability, chronic illness, and dependence on public insurance. Many of them Trump voters who were told that big government was the problem. They're the ones whose diabetes meds get more expensive, whose pain treatments get delayed, whose doctors start whispering that they don't really trust the new approval process. When eligibility rules tighten or drug formularies shift, it's these communities that feel it like a body blow. And here's the cruel irony: the same movement that told them, don't trust the experts, don't trust the regulators, don't trust the so-called deep state, is now busy turning those institutions into exactly what it claimed they were: not neutral guardians of the public interest, but battlegrounds where personal vendettas, corporate profits, and political branding collide. An FDA built on that logic doesn't collapse overnight. It rots slowly. Scientists stop speaking up because they've seen what happens to whistleblowers. Talented staff quietly leave for universities or the private sector. The people who stay learn the real rule: don't make trouble, don't challenge the fast track, don't question the boss publicly, because the last guy who did is either under investigation or out the door. That's how you go from evidence-based medicine to something closer to influence-based approvals, where the key variable is no longer the strength of the data, but the strength of the connections behind it. And once that transformation takes hold, every prescription handed across a pharmacy counter stops feeling like a promise and starts feeling like a bet placed on a rigged table. This is what Trumpism does when it seeps into institutions that were never supposed to be partisan toys. It replaces standards with stories, science with spectacle, and public duty with personal leverage. Think about what a functional FDA should look like. You never hear the names, you never see the fights, you don't know the internal politics because there aren't supposed to be any. Quiet, boring, methodical. It's one of the few places in government where boring is a compliment, because boring usually means stable, disciplined, and focused on data. What we're looking at now is the opposite of boring: a top regulator allegedly using his position to kneecap a rival's stock, a lawsuit framing him as a man who turned a government role into the extension of an old corporate feud, a health department pushing internal schemes to shrink months of scientific review into 24 hours while insisting it's all about efficiency and innovation. That's not an accident. That's the logical endpoint of years of Trump-style politics screaming that expertise is the enemy and loyalty is the only credential that matters. Under that worldview, the FDA is no longer a shield for the public. It's a battlefield for factions. One camp says Tidmarsh is a rogue official waging personal war on a company he hates. Another camp says he's the canary in the coal mine, punished for refusing to bless a reckless fast-track agenda that would turn drug approvals into a rubber stamp. Both stories can't be fully true, but here's the part that should terrify you. In either version, the system itself is already compromised. When a regulator's every move can move markets by hundreds of millions, that regulator cannot afford to be sloppy, partisan, or personally entangled. Yet that's exactly the culture that grew in the Trump era and never really left. Remember how Trump talked about the deep state and corrupt agencies? The goal was never to clean them up. The goal was to break trust so thoroughly that any attack on the rule book, any purge of professionals could be sold as reform, break the institution, fill the vacuum with loyalists, call it draining the swamp while you privatize the moat. Meanwhile, the economic stakes are enormous. Roughly 7 out of 10 Americans take at least one prescription drug. In low-income counties, prescription dependence is even higher, especially among seniors and disabled workers. These are not abstract consumers. These are people choosing between rent and insulin, groceries and antidepressants. For them, a single bad approval decision, a single rushed safety review, isn't policy. It's the difference between stability and catastrophe. Layer on top of that the geographic reality. The states with the highest disability and chronic illness rates are often the same states that banked hardest on Trump as their savior. They were told that elites in Washington, experts in agencies, regulators in DC didn't care about them. So Trump and his imitators promised to smash those systems in their name. Now, what they're getting instead is a regulatory regime that looks less accountable, less transparent, and more tangled in internal drama than ever. That's the brutal economic truth hiding behind the spectacle. When internal chaos hits the FDA, drug companies hedge their bets. They slow walk new trials, they funnel more money into lobbyists and less into risky research. Doctors start questioning whether approved really means what it used to. Insurance companies seize on any hint of uncertainty to delay coverage or deny reimbursement. Every small crack in legitimacy at the top becomes an excuse down the chain to shift costs and risk onto patients. And at the center of all this, you have a political movement that has spent nearly a decade attacking the very concept of neutral, evidence-based institutions. Trump didn't just insult regulators. He trained millions of people to see expertise as bias, standards as obstacles, and any limit on executive or corporate power as a plot by globalists and enemies within. You cannot run a 21st century health system on that ideology without eventually blowing up the credibility of the FDA. So now we're here. A major drug regulator exits under a cloud. A lawsuit alleges revenge. He claims retaliation. A health department hides behind vague phrases about serious concerns. And the only thing we can say with confidence is that the public is once again left in the dark, watching the people in charge argue over narratives, while no one explains how exactly any of this makes their medicine safer. This is why the details matter. It matters that a single LinkedIn post could erase $350 million in value. It matters that an internal plan tried to compress months of review into a day. It matters that hundreds of staff have left, that senior scientists are cycling in and out, that political pressure has become a normal part of the job. These aren't footnotes. They're symptoms of a deeper disease, a state captured by the very forces it's supposed to regulate. The real question isn't whether George Tidmarsh is a villain, a victim, or some mix of both. The real question is how a system designed to protect 330 million people became so vulnerable to ego, revenge, and political theater that one man's feud could shake confidence in an entire agency. You cannot build a healthy democracy on that foundation. You cannot rebuild trust in vaccines, treatments, or public health while Trumpism continues to teach people that institutions exist to be bent, bullied, or branded as enemies. If the FDA is allowed to drift further into this swamp of personal agendas and partisan pressure, then every future drug approval becomes a political act, not a scientific one, and every patient becomes collateral in someone else's power game. A country where medicine is decided by grudges, donors, and ideology instead of data is not just sick, it's already on life support. And the people pulling the levers are still arguing over who gets to own the ventilator.